Clara had always been a quiet, diligent girl, known for her gentle manners and her willingness to help anyone in the small frontier town where she lived. Nestled between rugged hills and dense forests, the town was harsh, its people wary of outsiders and unyielding in their morals. Life had been simple but hard, yet Clara had always found comfort in her family's small home. The familiar rhythm of chores, and the occasional moments of laughter with friends and neighbors. She had dreams of a peaceful life, a modest home, and perhaps someday a family of her own. But nothing in her young life could have prepared her for the storm that was about to descend. When her pregnancy was discovered, the town's perception of her changed instantly. What had been smiles and friendly greetings turned to whispers, sidelong glances, and cold stares. In a society that prized appearances and rigid morality above compassion, Clara's secret became her public shame. She tried to explain, tried to plead for understanding, but the moment she admitted the truth, the judgment was swift and merciless. Her parents, who had once been her staunch supporters, now spoke in hushed tones of disappointment and disgrace. They avoided her gaze and refused to acknowledge her presence in their home. Friends stopped visiting, and neighbors who had once nodded kindly now crossed the street to avoid her. The humiliation hit hardest in the town square during a weekly market day. Rumors had spread like wildfire, and a crowd gathered, curious and scandalized. Clara clutched her growing belly, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. Some whispered cruelly about the scandal she had brought upon her family. Others judged her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when societal rules are broken. She tried to hide, to shrink away from the humiliation, but there was nowhere to escape. The feeling of betrayal cut deep, not just from the townspeople, but from the very people she had loved and trusted most. Finally, her father's voice broke the silence, stern and unyielding. He declared that she could no longer live in their home, that the shame she had brought could not be overlooked. Clara's mother, too, turned away, tears glinting in her eyes, torn between maternal love and the fear of social reprisal. With only a small bundle of possessions, Clara was cast out into the wilderness surrounding the town, a place as unforgiving as the society that had rejected her. Alone and frightened, Clara faced the enormity of her new reality. The forest that stretched beyond the town's edges was vast and wild, full of unknown dangers, wild animals, harsh weather, and unforgiving terrain. She had never imagined having to fend for herself in such a manner, let alone with a child growing inside her. The nights were cold, and each step away from the town felt like a step further into uncertainty. Yet, despite the fear and heartbreak, a small spark of determination burned within her. She was a mother now, and the life growing inside her was hers to protect, no matter the cost. As she walked into the wilderness, Clara felt the weight of both loss and resolve. She had lost her home, her family's support, and the acceptance of the society she had always known. But she had not lost herself, nor her child. The shunning she endured became the first trial of many, shaping her into a woman who would need courage, resilience, and hope to survive the harsh realities ahead. In that moment, as the town faded behind her and the forest rose ahead, Clara understood that her life had irrevocably changed, but the story was far from over. Clara stepped into the wilderness with only the barest essentials, a small bundle of clothes, a worn blanket, and the tiny rattle of her unborn child, a reminder of the life she carried. The forest beyond the town seemed both threatening and strangely alive, with the scent of pine and damp earth filling her senses. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a bird made her heart race. She had never ventured far into the woods, but now survival demanded that she learn quickly, that she adapt or perish. The first night was the hardest. Clara huddled beneath the branches of a low-hanging tree, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, shivering in the cold. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of warnings, and every crack of a branch made her jump. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but but she had little choice. The town had left her unprepared for life beyond its borders. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, regret, and sorrow. She imagined the warm hearths of the home she had left behind, the laughter she would never hear again, and the cruel glances that had pushed her into exile. Tears blurred her vision, and she whispered promises to her unborn child that she would survive, that she would keep him safe no matter what. Food was scarce. Clara had only a faint memory of foraging from childhood stories and brief lessons from her mother. She picked berries cautiously, aware that some could be poisonous. She caught a rabbit once with a makeshift snare, but even that tiny victory required effort she was barely able to muster in her weakened state. Water came from a small stream she found by following the sound of trickling water through the trees, but she had to filter it as best she could with cloth and patience. Each day was a test of endurance, each step a challenge to her strength and determination. The forest was not just a challenge of sustenance, it was a test of courage. Clara quickly learned to recognize the signs of danger: the tracks of wolves near the stream, the deeper, heavier marks of bears on the forest floor, and the sudden silence of birds when predators were near. Sleep became a precious commodity, snatched in brief intervals and always with one eye open. She learned to make quick shelters from branches and leaves, to light small fires that could be hidden from the night's watchful eyes, and to move quietly to avoid drawing attention. The wilderness demanded vigilance, and Clara responded with every ounce of resolve she possessed. Amid the struggle, Clara discovered an inner strength she had never realized she possessed. Fear remained, of course, but it no longer paralyzed her, it sharpened her senses, honed her instincts, and reminded her of her purpose. Her love for her unborn child became a guiding force, propelling her forward when her body screamed for rest. She began to notice the subtle rhythms of the forest, the sun's arc, the patterns of animal movement, the sense of edible plant skills that would become crucial for survival. Despite her determination, loneliness pressed upon her like a tangible weight. There were no friendly voices, no comforting touch, no assurances that she would make it through the night. The isolation gnawed at her spirit, and sometimes she would weep quietly, holding her belly and imagining the child she was bringing into such a harsh world. Yet even in those moments of despair, a glimmer of hope persisted. If she could survive the forest, perhaps she could find safety, perhaps even a place where they would be accepted. It was in these moments, as Clara navigated the first few weeks of her exile, that her resilience began to take shape. She became alert, cautious, and resourceful, learning to move with purpose and patience. The wilderness, though brutal and unrelenting, was teaching her survival, shaping her into someone capable of facing what was to come. And though she did not yet know it, fate had its own hand in this story. A protector was near, someone whose arrival would change everything, and whose presence would bring warmth, security, and a glimpse of the family she had been denied. The forest, vast and unyielding, had begun to shape Clara into a figure of quiet resilience. She had learned to move with caution, to forage for food, and to shield herself from the chill of night. Yet even with her newfound skills, there were days when exhaustion overwhelmed her, and the weight of carrying her unborn child made every step painful. On one such day, as she followed a narrow deer trail in search of edible roots, a rustling in the underbrush made her heart leap. She froze, clutching her belly instinctively, every muscle taut with fear. From the shadows emerged a man tall, lean, and moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness. His skin was sun-kissed, his eyes sharp and discerning, and his presence commanded a quiet authority. Clara's first instinct was to run, but the sudden appearance of a child in her womb made her hesitate. She sensed no immediate hostility in the stranger's demeanor, only a calm attentiveness, as if he were reading her fear and deciding whether she was friend or foe. The man spoke softly, in a language Clara did not understand. His tone, however, was gentle, almost coaxing, and it carried a reassurance she had not felt since being cast out. He approached slowly, showing no threat, and laid a bundle of food, a small piece of dried meat, and some berries at her feet. Clara's stomach growled in response, but her mind remained wary. Could she trust him? In her world, kindness was often a mask for danger, yet there was something in the man's posture, the careful way he avoided sudden movements, that whispered safety. Over the next few days the man, whom she would come to know as Tayanita, watched from a distance as Clara struggled to maintain her fragile existence. He observed her resourcefulness, her quiet determination, and her maternal devotion. When he finally stepped forward to offer assistance, it was not with commands or demands, but with small, deliberate gestures. A clean stream of water, a safe place to rest, and advice on tracking game. Clara, accustomed to harsh rejection and betrayal, hesitated, unsure whether to accept help. But hunger, fatigue, and the raw instinct to protect her child forced her to put aside suspicion, at least for now. The turning point came one evening when Clara, attempting to gather firewood, stumbled over a hidden root and fell, twisting her ankle painfully. Tayanita was there before she could even cry out, steadying her and helping her to sit. His hands were firm but careful, his gaze steady and unwavering. He spoke words she did not understand, yet the meaning was unmistakable. You are not alone. We will protect you. The simplicity of the gesture, the act of caring without expectation, touched a part of Clara she had long thought dead, buried beneath layers of shame and fear. Over time, Clara began to observe Tayanita's methods for living in the forest, how he tracked deer, read the movements of the wind, and interpreted the subtle signs of animal life. He shared these skills with her, patiently teaching her to hunt small game, identify edible plants, and understand the rhythms of the wilderness. With every lesson, Clara grew stronger, more confident, and less afraid of the dangers around her. She began to trust him, not blindly, but through observation and shared experience, a trust forged in necessity and quiet respect. The first spark of connection between them was subtle, yet undeniable. Clara, once a girl whose life had been dictated by rigid rules and harsh judgment, began to feel a sense of belonging in the wild under Tayanita's watchful presence. He, in turn, showed her that strength and kindness could coexist, that courage was not just a matter of survival but also of compassion. Together they navigated the forest, their bond forming silently, built on trust, mutual respect, and the unspoken promise of protection. In the vast wilderness, far from the judgments of her past life, Clara began to glimpse a possibility she had never imagined, that she and her child might survive, that she might be safe, and that perhaps, in this unlikely encounter, she had found not only a protector, but the first hint of a family she could call her own. The first chill of winter had begun to bite at the edges of the forest, and Clara found herself shivering more often, despite the layers of clothing she had wrapped around her. Nights were especially harsh, with winds slicing through the trees and frost forming along the edges of her makeshift shelter. Her small bundle of blankets offered little comfort, and the thought of her unborn child trembling in the cold made her heart ache. She had learned to endure hunger and danger, but she had not anticipated how the cold could gnaw at both body and spirit, testing her limits in ways she had never imagined. Tayanita noticed her discomfort immediately. He had spent countless hours observing the forest, reading its signs, and learning its secrets. And he had also been watching Clara with a careful, protective eye. One evening, as she sat curled beneath a tree, her teeth chattering despite her blankets, he approached with a garment in his hands. It was a cloak woven with intricate patterns and dyed with the deep, earthy colors of his people. The edges were lined with soft, warm material, and the weight of it suggested both warmth and strength. At first, Clara recoiled slightly. She had been taught to distrust gifts from strangers, to be wary of any kindness that might hide ulterior motives. But Tayanita did not speak harshly, did not demand acceptance. Instead, he extended the cloak slowly, gently, as though offering a promise rather than a mere item of clothing. The gesture was deliberate, careful, and unassuming. Yet it carried a power far beyond the physical warmth the cloak could provide. With a hesitant hand, Clara reached out and took the cloak. It was heavier than she expected, but as she wrapped it around herself and draped it over her belly, a sense of protection settled over her. It was more than warmth. It was a shield against the harshness of the world, a tangible symbol of care and acceptance. Her child, nestled against her chest, seemed to sense the difference as well, settling quietly against the soft folds of the cloak. Tayanita watched silently, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. In his culture, the act of giving a cloak was deeply symbolic. It was a gesture of protection, trust, and inclusion. By wrapping Clara and her child in it, he was not only offering physical warmth, but also signaling that they were under his care, that they were no longer alone in the wilderness. Clara, though unfamiliar with the customs and meanings of his people, felt the weight of his intention. For the first time since being cast out, she felt a flicker of hope and safety. Over the next few days, the cloak became more than a garment. It was a reminder that someone had chosen to protect them, that they were valued despite the judgments of a world that had rejected them. When she moved through the forest, the cloak shielded her from the wind, concealed her from prying eyes, and offered a comforting sense of stability. Clara began to carry herself differently, her movements more confident, her posture steadier, her steps lighter. The cloak was a mantle of courage as well as warmth. The gift of the cloak also deepened the bond between Clara and Tayanita. It was a silent communication, a bridge over the gap of fear, mistrust, and cultural difference that existed between them. It demonstrated that survival in the wilderness was not merely about skill or knowledge, but also about human connection, compassion, and the willingness to extend care without expectation. Clara realized that she was beginning to trust him not just as a protector, but as someone who saw her as more than a cast-out woman, someone who recognized her worth and humanity. In the quiet moments by the fire, as Tayanita taught her to read the signs of the forest and she listened attentively, Clara often traced her fingers along the patterns of the cloak, marveling at its beauty and the significance of its gift. It was a turning point in her journey, a moment that transformed fear into hope, isolation into the first inkling of companionship, and despair into the promise of a future where she and her child might thrive. Wrapped in the cloak, Clara felt a profound sense of belonging she had not known since childhood, and she began to understand that sometimes protection and love come from the most unexpected places. The days grew shorter and the forest colder, yet under Tayanita's watchful eye, Clara began to discover a rhythm to life in the wilderness that she had never known. What had once been an endless series of terrifying challenges became, slowly, a manageable routine. Every lesson he taught her was a step toward independence, yet it carried the deeper message that she was not alone. From tracking animals to identifying edible plants, from reading the signs of the wind to finding shelter in the dense woods, each skill Tayanita imparted became a lifeline, a means not only of survival but of connection. The first lessons were small but crucial. Tayanita showed her how to move silently through the forest, how to position herself to spot tracks in the soft earth, and how to sense approaching danger without panicking. Clara watched intently, her hands mimicking his motions, her mind absorbing every nuance. At first, she fumbled, her movements awkward and uncertain, but Tayanita's patience never wavered. When she failed, he simply demonstrated again, correcting her gently, without scorn or impatience. Each day her confidence grew and she began to feel the thrill of small victories. Catching a rabbit with a snare, she had set herself finding fresh water in the most unlikely places, building a fire that burned long enough to cook her first meal in weeks. The forest, which had once seemed a hostile prison, began to feel like a teacher. Clara learned to interpret the subtle signs of the wilderness. The way birds would suddenly fall silent to warn of a predator, the direction of the wind to determine whether the patterns of animal trails that indicated the safest paths. Tyanita was not just instructing her in survival. He was teaching her to listen, to observe, to understand the world around her as part of it rather than a victim of it. She found herself marveling at his knowledge, the ease with which he navigated the forest, the way he could sense danger long before it became visible. His presence was reassuring, but more than that, it inspired a sense of awe. Caring for her unborn child remained Clara's top priority, and Tyanita guided her in ways that were both practical and compassionate. He showed her how to gather nourishing plants, how to prepare them safely, and how to build sleeping arrangements that would keep both her and the baby safe and warm. He explained how to move cautiously through the forest while carrying her child, teaching her to distribute weight and conserve energy. Each lesson was tinged with care, a reminder that he recognized not only her struggle but her value, and that she was capable of more than she had believed. The rhythm of their days created an unspoken bond. They shared the quiet of dawn spent walking through misty trees, the warmth of firelight at night, and the simple satisfaction of surviving the challenges of the day. Tyanita occasionally told stories of his people, tales of warriors, of survival, of honor and family. Though many were unfamiliar to Clara, they carried lessons in resilience and courage. She, in turn, shared her own experiences, though often haltingly, her voice carrying the weight of shame, regret, and hope. In these exchanges, trust began to grow, subtle but undeniable. Clara's perception of herself shifted. She was no longer merely a frightened, cast-out girl. She was a survivor, a mother-to-be, and a learner. Each day spent in the forest with Tyanita strengthened her physically and emotionally, and she realized that her fears, though still present, no longer dominated her. The wilderness, once a symbol of isolation, had become a crucible in which her courage, resilience, and determination were forged. By the time the first snow threatened to blanket the forest, Clara could hunt, gather, and move with a confidence that would have been unimaginable when she was cast out of her town. Yet the greatest lesson was not merely in survival, it was in companionship. She understood now that strength could be shared, that vulnerability could coexist with courage, and that trust, once earned, could transform fear into hope. In the shadow of Tyanita's guidance, Clara and her child were no longer merely surviving, they were beginning to live. Life in the forest had begun to settle into a rhythm for Clara and Tyanita. The chill of winter was pressing harder against the trees, but with Tyanita's guidance and the warmth of his cloak, Clara felt a sense of safety she had never known. Her child grew strong, and she herself had transformed from a frightened, cast-out girl into a resourceful, determined woman. Yet even in the midst of this fragile peace, the past had a way of finding her. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when fueled by gossip, resentment, and a sense of moral superiority. Rumors of Clara's survival had reached the frontier settlement where she had been cast out. Some townsfolk, driven by anger or the desire to correct her perceived transgression, began organizing a small posse. They saw her continued freedom as an affront to their judgment, a challenge to the rigid social order they clung to so tightly. These men, armed and resolute, were determined to drag her back, to restore what they considered the moral balance and punish her once again for defying them. Clara sensed the danger first in subtle ways. She noticed unfamiliar tracks near the stream she used for water, the distant sound of voices carried faintly on the wind, and the sudden tension in the forest's usual rhythm. Her instincts, honed over weeks of survival, screamed a warning. She recognized the tracks immediately as human, and not the cautious, respectful steps of someone like Tyanita, but the heavy, careless prints of those unaccustomed to moving through the wilderness. Anxiety gripped her. She had survived the wild, but could she survive the judgmental wrath of the society that had already betrayed her once? Tyanita, too, noticed the signs. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the forest floor, reading the tracks with the precision only a seasoned warrior could possess. He realized that Clara's past was catching up with her, bringing with it a threat that skill alone might not overcome. Yet there was no panic in him, only calm, deliberate assessment. He began preparing her, teaching her how to move silently, how to hide effectively, and how to use the forest itself as a shield. For the first time, Clara faced a danger that combined both her old life and the world she had tried to leave behind. And she understood that survival now would require both courage and strategy. Over the following days, the tension grew. Clara could feel the weight of her past pressing in, a reminder that the world outside the forest remained harsh and unforgiving. She wrestled with fear, not just for herself, but for her unborn child, whose safety depended entirely on her ability to anticipate danger and act decisively. She remembered the townspeople's cruel whispers, the faces of those who had turned away, and the moment she had been cast out. The thought of them finding her, of the possibility of being dragged back into humiliation and shame, filled her with dread. Yet alongside fear came determination. Tyanita's presence was a steadying force, a reminder that she did not face this threat alone. Together they devised plans, mapped escape routes, and discussed contingencies should the posse get closer. Clara began to notice her own growth, how she could read signs, make decisions, and act with precision. The lessons Tyanita had taught her were no longer abstract skills. They were tools for survival against human threats as well as natural ones. In the quiet moments before nightfall, as the wind whispered through the trees and the forest seemed to hold its breath, Clara realized something important. The world she had left behind was still dangerous, but she had changed. She was no longer the helpless girl who had been cast out. She was a mother, a survivor, and a partner to a man who valued her strength. And though the threat from the past loomed, she understood that together, she and Tyanita could face it not as victims, but as equals prepared to protect their future at any cost. The days in the forest were growing colder, but Clara no longer felt the same fear that had once gripped her so tightly. With Tyanita's guidance, she had learned not just to survive, but to move with purpose, to read the signs of the wilderness, and to care for herself and her unborn child with growing confidence. Yet it was not just her survival skills that were evolving. It was her understanding of trust, companionship, and the quiet power of shared experiences. Tyanita had become more than a protector. He had become a companion, a guide, and increasingly, a confidant. The lessons he taught were no longer purely practical. As he instructed her in hunting, tracking, and finding safe shelter, he would also speak of balance in life, the importance of patience, and the quiet strength found in knowing one's own heart. Though Clara did not always understand the words, the tone, the careful rhythm of his speech, and the meaning behind the gestures conveyed wisdom and care. She began to see him not just as a strong warrior, but as someone whose character was anchored in honor and empathy. The bond between them deepened during shared moments of vulnerability. On nights when the cold was sharpest, Tyanita would sit near the fire, offering the warmth of his presence without intrusion. Clara, hesitant at first, began to speak of her fears, her loneliness, and the unbearable shame of being cast out. She spoke of the child she carried, of the hope she dared not name, and the dreams that had been snatched from her by judgment and cruelty. Tyanita listened, patient and attentive, never judging, never rushing, and sometimes sharing small stories of his own stories of loss, of the weight of responsibility, and of the quiet joys that sustained him in the harsh wilderness. Through these exchanges, trust flourished. Clara began to rely not just on his skills, but on his presence. She recognized that his care was not fleeting or conditional. It was steady, consistent, and grounded in a desire to protect, guide, and nurture. She felt a growing sense of safety, not the fragile safety she had once known within the walls of her family home, but a deeper, more resilient form of security that came from knowing someone saw her worth and would stand by her through every challenge. The bond was also forged through shared labor and survival. They hunted together, each relying on the other's strengths. Clara learned to anticipate Tyanita's movements, to trust his instincts, and to coordinate silently in the forest's quiet choreography. When she made mistakes, he corrected her gently. When he faltered, she offered insight or assistance. Together, they became a team, their connection reinforced by the dependence each had on the other. There was also a subtle, unspoken intimacy developing in the way they moved through the world. Clara noticed small gestures, the way Tyanita adjusted the cloak around her shoulders to keep her warm, how he placed his hand on her back to guide her across rough terrain, and the quiet attention he paid to her comfort and safety. These acts, simple yet profound, carried meaning that words could not fully capture. They communicated respect, care, and the beginnings of a deeper emotional connection. As the forest whispered around them, Clara began to realize that her heart, long hardened by rejection, was softening. She felt gratitude, admiration, and slowly a tender affection that frightened and excited her in equal measure. She understood that she was not just surviving alongside Tyanita, she was forming a family, a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and growing love. By the time the threat from the town drew closer, their bond had become a source of strength. Clara no longer felt alone nor powerless. She had someone who truly understood her, who shared in her struggles, and who would face danger alongside her without hesitation. In the shadow of the trees and beneath the vast, unending sky, Clara discovered that the wilderness had not only tested her resolve, but had led her to a connection she had never imagined possible, a bond that would sustain her, protect her child, and transform her life forever. The quiet rhythm of the forest, once a source of comfort and routine for Clara and Tyanita, was suddenly broken. The signs had been subtle at first: disturbed underbrush, unfamiliar tracks, and the distant echo of human voices. But now, as dusk settled over the trees, the threat was undeniable. The posse from the town, armed and resolute, had arrived, their intentions clear. They were not coming with compassion or curiosity. They were coming to punish, to reclaim, to enforce the moral judgment that had exiled Clara in the first place. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the gravity of the situation. Every step she had taken in the wilderness had prepared her for survival, but never for this: a confrontation with human malice and rigid cruelty. Fear surged, but it was tempered by the calm presence of Tyanita at her side. His dark eyes scanned the forest with precision, noting the positions of the intruders, the gaps in their formation, and the best routes for both defense and retreat. She realized with a mix of awe and relief that she was no longer alone in facing danger. She had a partner who could match her courage with experience, whose knowledge and strength far exceeded anything the townsfolk could anticipate. The first encounter was tense and cautious. The posse advanced through the trees, shouting for Clara, their voices harsh and judgmental, carrying both accusation and expectation. Tyanita moved silently, guiding Clara behind cover, instructing her on where to stand, how to remain unseen, and when to move. He did not speak in commands, but in quiet signals, hand gestures, and subtle movements that Clara had learned to interpret. The forest became their ally, the trees and underbrush masking their presence and giving them the advantage of surprise. When the townsfolk caught sight of Clara, the first reaction was shock. They had expected to find a frightened, defeated girl weak, ashamed, and ready to be dragged back to their judgment. Instead, they saw someone transformed, alert, confident, and accompanied by a formidable figure who exuded both skill and authority. Tyanita stepped forward, a silent barrier between Clara and those who sought to harm her. His presence alone commanded respect. The posse faltered, uncertain how to proceed against a man who moved with the certainty of someone entirely at home in the wilderness. The confrontation escalated as the townsfolk attempted to push closer. Tyanita used the forest's natural cover, creating diversions and misleading trails, ensuring that they could not approach directly without risk. Clara, following his guidance, moved with agility and precision, using every skill she had learned to protect herself and her child. When one of the men reached for her, Tyanita's voice rang out a low, commanding sound that made the intruder pause, and a swift but controlled motion reminded them that aggression here would not go unchallenged. The encounter ended without bloodshed, though not without tension. Realizing that their target could not be easily coerced or intimidated, the posse eventually retreated, grumbling and defeated. Clara stood amidst the trees, her heart still racing, yet feeling a profound sense of triumph. She had faced human threat as well as natural danger, and had survived not alone, but with someone who trusted her, guided her, and fought alongside her. In the quiet aftermath as they returned to their shelter, Clara felt the bond between her and Tyanita deepen even further. Survival had forged trust, and trust had blossomed into something stronger, a connection rooted in shared hardship, courage, and unwavering support. For the first time, Clara realized that she was not just safe, she was part of something larger than herself, protected not only by skill but by loyalty, respect, and care. The confrontation had tested more than physical survival. It had tested the strength of their partnership, the depth of their trust, and the courage of Clara's heart. She understood now that no force, whether the forest, human cruelty, or the cold judgment of her past life, could undo what they had built together. And as the night fell over the forest, she held her child close, wrapped in the warmth of Tyanita's cloak, knowing that they had survived, and that their bond had been forever strengthened by the fire of adversity. The forest, once a place of uncertainty and danger, had become a sanctuary for Clara and her child, thanks to Tyanita's guidance and protection. Yet the true transformation awaited them beyond the trees, within the circle of Tyanita's Comanche community. After the confrontation with the townsfolk, he decided it was time to introduce Clara to his people, a group whose acceptance would offer her and her child not just survival, but belonging, identity, and a future that had once seemed impossible. The journey to the community was quiet and deliberate. Clara, still cautious, followed Tyanita's lead, her senses attuned to every sound and movement in the forest. Despite the tension, a sense of anticipation stirred within her. She wondered how they would be received. She had been shunned by her own people for the circumstances of her pregnancy. Would these strangers treat her differently? Tyanita's calm presence reassured her, his steady hand occasionally brushing against hers in a gesture that spoke volumes without words. When they finally arrived at the Comanche encampment, Clara was struck by its vibrancy. The community lived in harmony with the land, their tents and lodges arranged with care, smoke rising from cooking fires, and children playing freely in the open spaces. The adults greeted Tyanita with respect and warmth, their eyes reflecting trust in a man who had long proven his courage and loyalty. But it was their curiosity and openness toward Clara and her child that truly touched her heart. The first moments were tentative. Clara clutched her child, unsure how to respond to the stares and whispers. But Tyanita moved beside her confidently, introducing her to his people, explaining in their language her circumstances and the trials she had endured. His words carried not judgment, but truth and respect. Slowly, the community approached, offering gestures of welcome, warm food, clean water, and blankets for the child. Each act, small but profound, communicated acceptance. Clara felt the tension in her shoulders ease, her heart opening to the possibility of being part of something she had never imagined. Over the following days, Clara learned the rhythms of the Comanche community. She observed their traditions, listened to their stories, and began participating in daily tasks, from gathering herbs to helping care for the children. The people treated her with kindness, offering guidance without condescension, sharing skills that would help her and her child thrive in this new environment. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of belonging that went beyond mere protection. It was a place where she was valued, where her contributions mattered, and where her child could grow safe and loved. The acceptance of the community was transformative. Clara began to shed the shame and self-doubt instilled by her past. She realized that her worth was not defined by the judgment of those who had cast her out, but by the love and care she received and gave within this new circle. The child, once a source of fear for her due to the societal rejection surrounding his birth, became a symbol of hope and continuity. He was embraced by the community, playing freely with other children, learning from those around him, and basking in the unconditional care that had been absent from his early days. Tayanita's role in this transition was pivotal. Through his actions and the trust he placed in her, Clara recognized that family and acceptance could be chosen and nurtured. He had not only protected them from the dangers of the forest and the judgment of outsiders, but he had also guided them to a place where they could belong. Their bond, already strong, deepened further as they navigated the dynamics of the community together, supporting one another in both small and significant ways. By the time winter's grip loosened slightly, Clara had fully embraced her new life. She was no longer a cast-out girl wandering the wilderness. She was a mother, a partner, and a valued member of a community that had taken her in without judgment. In the warmth of the Comanche fires, surrounded by people who had chosen to welcome her, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. At last she could envision a future not defined by rejection, but by family, love, and belonging. The first rays of dawn stretched across the Comanche village, casting golden light over the familiar shapes of tents, lodges, and the quiet stirrings of people beginning their day. For Clara, the morning carried a weight of reflection she had rarely felt before. She stood wrapped in Tayanita's cloak, the soft folds draping over her shoulders, and around her child, a symbol of protection, warmth, and the journey that had brought her here. It had been months since she had been cast out, months filled with fear, hardship, and uncertainty. Yet here she was, alive, safe, and part of a family she had never imagined. Life in the community had transformed her. Clara's skills in the wilderness, honed under Tayanita's careful guidance, had allowed her to thrive, but it was the acceptance of the Comanche people that gave her spirit its full strength. She watched her child playing with other children, laughing freely, his curiosity unhindered by the shadows of shame that had marked his earliest days. Every smile, every laugh, every tiny hand reaching out in trust reinforced what Clara had come to understand. Her child was safe, loved, and cherished, not in spite of his origins, but because of the life they were now building together. Tayanita emerged from the lodge, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet warmth that spoke more than words ever could. Over time, the bond between them had grown into something profound, a partnership founded on trust, respect, and mutual care. He had been her protector, her teacher, and her unwavering companion through the darkest chapters of her life, and now he was her partner in hope, courage, and love. Together they had faced the wilderness, human cruelty, and the ghosts of her past, and together they had emerged stronger. Their mornings were filled with a gentle routine that honored both survival and connection. They gathered herbs for healing, checked traps for small game, and helped with the daily work of sustaining the village. Yet there was always time for quiet moments sitting by the fire, sharing stories of past struggles and imagining the life they could continue to build. Each day, Clara felt herself becoming not just a part of the community, but an integral member, contributing her own skills, insights, and heart to the people who had welcomed her without judgment. The symbolic importance of the cloak never waned. It reminded Clara of the first act of compassion she had received from Tayanita, the warmth that had kept her and her child alive, the acceptance that had given her hope, and the gesture that had begun to heal the wounds inflicted by society's cruelty. Wearing it now, she felt a connection not only to him, but to the journey they had shared, a journey that had transformed fear into strength, isolation into belonging, and despair into hope. Clara also reflected on her own growth. The girl who had been cast out, shamed for circumstances beyond her control, had become a mother, a survivor and a woman who had learned to navigate the world with skill, wisdom, and courage. She had faced the wilderness alone, learned to trust another deeply, and discovered the power of acceptance, love, and community. Her transformation was complete, and yet it felt like only the beginning, a foundation upon which she could build a life of joy, stability, and fulfillment. The child, nestled against her in the cloak, stirred and looked up at her with wide eyes. Clara smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace. Every hardship, every fear, every lonely night had led to this moment. She had found family in the most unexpected of places, safety in a wilderness that had once seemed hostile, and love in a man whose courage matched the strength of his heart. As the village awakened around them, Clara knew that the past would not define her future. She had survived judgment, exile, and fear, but now she was free to nurture her child, free to grow alongside Tyanita, and free to embrace the life that had once seemed impossible. In the warmth of the cloak, in the laughter of her child, and in the quiet strength of the man beside her, Clara finally understood what it meant to belong, to be loved, and to live fully. Her journey had led her here to safety, family, and a new life that promised hope, joy, and enduring love.